First, let's do the update. Xun, you have anything to update?
Yeah. First is fixed RESTIC S3 backend bug introduced in the new version included with Velero 1.9.4, and the second is still in progress item. I am refactoring the restore controller, and that's all.
And there is
question.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, the RESTIC bug, is that fixed in 1.9.5?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So there is also a design ready for review, right?
I think the design is already approved and it's ready to be implemented.
Okay, because you said you want to discuss with me, and I was pretty busy with some other stuff, so I didn't have a chance to look at it. So yeah, could you send me the link to the PR, and I can take a look maybe?
Oh, okay.
Next me.
Yeah, Velero 1.9.5 is released yesterday for RESTIC bug fix. Yeah, that's all.
Okay, thank you. And for me, I'm trialing the issue on my side for 1.11 candidates, and also for specific role, I'm debugging an error handling issue in Velero's plugin framework. For some reason, in some plugin, the error is not transferred correctly to the Velero code. So when the error happens in some of the plugin code, we cannot lock the error. I'm debugging that issue. In addition to that, I'm also discussing with Yunhui about the data mover design and POC. And that's all from my part. Scott?
Yeah, so a few PRs out there now. The backup item action v2 implementation is ready for view. That's actually not a new PR. I had a draft version of it earlier, but it's been updated now that the overall design for that has been approved. So that's ready for view. I have the Velero plugin example. I have a PR that goes along with that updates adds a v2 plugin to the Velero plugin example to test with it. So that's still draft just because it points to the PR branch because that's what the code it needs is not in main yet. So the other new PR that I just submitted yesterday, 5710, that's the backup restore phases that adds the new waiting for plugin operations and waiting for plugin operations partially failed to the backup and restore list of valid phases. And that also updates the CRDs and the docs appropriately for that. And then I have a minor update to the design PR. This is relating in part to your comments before. Basically, we have some clarifications on cancel operation.
Yeah.
What's expected. Item operation JSON, I updated that to include status information. And then a couple of minor fixes. I realized that my operation progress struct had a duplicate field in it. I was using completed for a Boolean yes or no, and also completed for a number of items completed. So I changed one of those to end completed. And the other change was the original proposal had waiting for plugin operations partial failure. But I realized looking and doing the PR for the phases that the existing similar phase is partially failed, not partial failure. So I wanted to make sure that those were consistent.
Oh yeah.
So I made that change as well. So that PR is not blocking anything because it's all minor changes that we mostly discussed, but it is out there. Hopefully we can get that approved and then just to make sure that the approved design matches everything we're doing.
Okay, I see. I'll take a look at that one.
What's that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a look at that one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and the only other thing is, and this one's also still draft, I have a restore item action implementation PR. That was also updated with all the changes. The reason it's in draft is that right now that depends on the backup item action, because the backup item action, since that's the first V2 plugin, it also has some infrastructure, for the builds to make sure that, because it's using a new directory, to make sure all that makes it in. So because of that, the restore item action can't be merged until the backup item action was done first. So that's the only reason why that one's in drafts. It's ready for review in terms of content. So if you want to look at it, comment on it, that's great. It's just not ready to approve and merge yet until the backup item action one gets done.
Okay. So I see you're making a progress on your side, but if you feel you are blocked, you should feel free to ping me or ping Yonghui on the Slack so we can take a look quickly. Also, we discussed internally, Yonghui will be following up with all these V2 changes in 1.11, and unfortunately he's down with COVID, so maybe this part is slow a little bit. I think he will reach out to you later after he's recovered and review these PRs.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
I'll also mention on the just scheduling side, I'm here so 2 more days this week, and then I'm out through the end of December. I'm back on January 3rd.
Sure. Yeah, we are all in VMware. We are all taking the last week of the year off. So
Right.
yeah,
So
we'll be back in January.
okay, so it sounds like my vacation kind of matches closely to your theme anyway. So
Yeah.
basically, right now I'm not blocked on anything. I'm starting to kind of look into the next steps in terms of implementing controller changes. But obviously, before I'm ready to submit those PRs, the ones that are out now are going to need to be merged.
Sure.
And as we discussed before on the previous week, I still expect to get the volume snapshotter API PR out there, relatively soon, but it's a lower priority right now because it's, we can do the rest of it without it, or it can be in there. That can kind of go either way depending on scheduling. So I'm not focusing yet on that one.
Sure. So as for the volume snapshotter, will there be any impact if we don't do that in 1.11?
So there's, not really, just because I don't think that we're planning on updating the volume snapshotters yet. Ideally, once all this is done and the API is available and the controller changes are made, the next step would be to update the AWS and Azure and GCP plugins, volume snapshotter, to implement those parts. Again, that's.
So do you recall the motivation for making the change in volume snapshot? I recall there used to be some issue on the GCP, but for AWS or Azure, things work pretty well. I don't think we need to trigger any.
So the volume snapshot was actually the core of the original design that Dave put in place that we're modifying. And the reason for volume snapshotter being added to this is that when a volume snapshotter plugin creates a snapshot and returns, the uploading of the snapshot to AWS or GCP is happening in the background. And what will happen if you immediately restore from backup after creating a backup with snapshots is you can actually hit into situations where that snapshot's not ready yet. So when the AWS, for example, or GCP volume snapshotters implement the feature here, where we would do the progress, that can check on whether that upload is done, and we won't then move the backup to completed until it's done. So since the volume snapshotters already do the uploading in the background, the impact is not so much on implementing anything asynchronously. The impact is on getting that progress information back, which will then allow Velero to not mark a backup as completed until the snapshots are all uploaded. So basically that eliminates a race condition once that's done.
But
I'm I've seen this in the past myself. If you do a backup with snapshots, especially for large file systems, and you then immediately restore, it's going to fail because that snapshot won't be ready to use yet.
But will there be any API, on the cloud service like AWS, are there API to check the progress of this uploading?
I don't know if we can get a percentage out of that. I do know, I'm pretty sure, because again, I was when I ran into this problem in the past, we didn't end up fixing it in Velero at the time upstream, but there was a way to determine whether the snapshot was ready to use. And so, the thing with the progress is that the minimal progress implementation for something like this would be, hey, is it done or not done? And, if you can't give a percentage that's useful, that's okay. The done versus not done allows Velero to not mark a backup as complete until that's happened.
So you're saying
So-
there is some API call to tell us if this uploading is done or not, but we just don't know about the progress. Yeah, I think that would be good enough for the V2 integration.
Right, exactly. I mean, and again, we can kind of separate the question of the API definition from implementing it. To implement the API definition, we don't need to worry about any of that because we're just adding the functions to that API, for Velero to use. Kind of the sequence there is we have to update the API definition to add those new functions. We then have to update the controller to call those functions.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have to update the plugins themselves to implement those functions. So basically, if we implement the API and the controller changes, but don't yet update the plugins to V2, there's no change to behavior from currently. But we have to do those Velero core changes first before we can update the plugins to actually implement that.
Yeah. My only concern is that if there is a way to tell the uploading is done or not. If there's no way to do that, I don't think it makes many sense for the V2. But if you, like you said, if there's a way we can check if this.
And I haven't looked at this recently because I know I looked into this when I first ran into the issue. And this is at least a year ago. I remember I could determine whether it was done or not. I didn't look into progress questions, but I'm reasonably sure that we can get that. And that's something I definitely want to look into before I, spend any time on it.
Okay, sure.
My approach to the volume snapshot aside right now is it's still in kind of a nice to have category, and we want it there. But if adding it, puts the release timing, at risk, then we can defer it to 112.
Okay, so
because if we don't add it, it's not any better or any worse than the current behavior. So we're not introducing a regression. Nothing gets messed up.
Right.
And it's even okay to add just the API, for example, but not the controller part because it's all incremental. Again, you do that, but you don't do the next step. You haven't broken anything. You've just made a smaller task for later. So, if I hit a point where I'm blocking on something else and I can put that in place, we might get to it. But at the same time, the focus is going to be making sure it works for backup item action and restore item action.
Yeah.
And we can add the volume snapshot part later. That's not a problem. And that will just be something on the 112 roadmap if we don't get to it in 111. This may be one of those calls that, when we have that feature freeze in January, at that point, we're going to make the call, oh, we haven't started this yet. We're going to pull it out of scope. Or, we have started it. Here's what's left. It looks pretty low risk. We'll keep it in. So I think that's the time when we can make the final call as to whether we're pushing this to 112 versus not. And just honestly, given how much time is in the schedule, I think it's very likely at this point that we are going to say, hey, we're not going to get this in 111, but it's okay for 112. It doesn't really affect data mover anyway. For completeness, we want it, and it does solve a problem. But if we do it in 112 versus 11, from my point of view, that's not a huge difference in terms of, certainly Red Hat needs. Again, we want it. And if we have a date that it's going to be ready by, that's great. But it's not as critical for us as the backup item action, restore item action work.
So we should suggest we focus on the backup item action and restore item action, and to verify this API change. If that works, let's merge the design of volume snapshot V2 and implement it by calling the API on the cloud service. Do you think that flow will work?
Yeah. And again, I think I can confirm that, before I do any work on this. I think confirming that there's a way to implement it, like you said, to say, hey, is this done? Is it not done? Are we waiting? Because at that point, because we have a snapshot ID. As far as I understand, right now, and again, I need to look into this because my memory's a little fuzzy. It's been a while. It was as simple as querying, is this snapshot ID ready? Because basically, I believe there's a status on the snapshot, and it's like pending versus. I don't remember what the actual status string is, but I believe we can get it from the status to understand, oh, this is still uploading, or oh, this is ready to go. And if that should be all we need for that minimum progress implementation. If we can get a percentage, that's better, but it's not essential. And that's kind of part of why we made that operation progress struct a bit more flexible. If we have detailed progress, we can say 5 out of 10 or 1,000 out of whatever. But if we don't have detailed information, we just have a phase. The phase is uploading. We can put that in the string description field. And when it's done, then it's complete. We mark it, true, and then the backup can move on. So I do need to confirm that and look back at those APIs because it's been a while. But I think that's how it works.
Yeah, I don't think you have to look at the API, but it sounds like you really want to merge the volume snapshot plugin v2 in 1.11. Is that so?
Again, I would rather do it then, but I don't want to risk the release on it. So it's a lower priority from my own kind of scheduling of time versus some of these other tasks like the new phases and the JSON file and the file upload and some of that. So if there's not time for it by a code freeze, then obviously it slips. But if there's time for it and it's going to work, then it would be better to get this all in at once, just because we're implementing that way. It's just kind of all the async work kind of together all at once in 1.11. But again, if we can't fit it in due to sort of schedule constraints, that's fine. And that'll be the volume snapshot will be the one part of this work that it makes perfect sense to defer to 1.12, and that's going to be fine if we do. I think first part of January will be the right time to make that call. And again, I think there's a good chance that we will want to defer it, just because there's a lot of things that need to get reviewed and merged, and this is a lower priority than those other things.
Yeah. So let me clarify. So if we decide to defer the volume snapshot or v2 to 1.12, shall we also defer merging the design in 1.12 so that we do all this in one minor release?
I would say the design, since we already merged the design for the feature overall, and the volume snapshotter is a component of that. I would think that actually, I thought we had merged that already. I don't remember off the top of my head. The design PR for that may already be merged.
Okay.
So I can check, but and I think the design we should go ahead and merge if we're fine with it, because I think the only reason we would defer it at this point is scheduling. And actually, I can check right now just to see, because there may actually, let's see here. So yeah, because when I was looking at my open pull request earlier today, I didn't think I saw that. But yeah, it's already merged. The only open PRs I have now are the 2 backup and restore item action and API implementations, the minor updates to the design, and that backup restore phases. So we've already merged the design here. It's only a question of what I haven't done yet is created a PR for implementing that API for volume snapshotter.
Okay, so let's defer that work to 1.12. You think that's okay? So let's focus on the BIA.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Again, if we get to the end and there's time, we can talk about it again. But realistically, let's focus on the things that have to be here.
Yeah.
We've already started doing the work with backup and restore item action with the phases, and I know there's several more follow-on tasks that have to get done by the end of January, beginning of February, in terms of implementing the changes to the controllers and all of that, and that's kind of going to be where the bulk of the work is.
Yep. So I'm also curious, after the V2 has been merged, I don't think we need to update all the existing backup item action
No,
plugins to
not at
V2?
all. One of the features of the plugin versioning is that when you create a new
Right.
plugin version under the package plugin code in Velero, there's an adapter that gets written, and what happens is that Velero pulls the V1 plugin out, and then it wraps this in this adapter package, so that the Velero controller gets a V2 plugin for everything, but the plugin that it's actually calling through the gRPC might be a V1 plugin, and this adapter will supply those missing changes. So, for example, for progress and cancel, those don't exist in V1 plugins. The adapter will, in the case of cancel, it just returns, nil, it doesn't do anything. In the case of progress, it's going to actually return an error, unsupported operation. And since Velero's controller is only going to ever call progress on a plugin that returns an operation ID, for a V1 plugin, that'll never be returned, which means it'll never call it. So,
Right.
So V1 plugins should be 100% functional. That was a big part of that design of plugin versioning in general, was to make sure that you don't need to update to V1 plugin. Old plugins will still work. And if you look at my Velero plugin example PR, that adds a V2 backup item action plugin, but also leaves the V1 plugin in place. And if you actually run Velero with that, you'll see and again, the plugin example plugins really just make a log entry so that you can see that the plugin ran. And when you run it, you'll see that the V1 plugins and the V2 plugins both run. So they can exist side by side. You can add a V1 plugin and a V2 plugin, and they both will work. The only difference is the V1 plugin goes through that adapter that's defined as part of that plugin implementation. And then my backup item action plugin PR that's there, you can see the adapter in there. It's part of the things, one of the things implemented there.
I see. So by the way, because there is some change in the backup controller needed to handle this V2 backup item action and restore item actions, you have done some POC internally with this your existing VolSync stuff to verify the work, right? Or that's something we need to verify.
Well, we haven't really done anything on the VolSync side with this yet, because it's not going to be functional in terms of, for these asynchronous actions to actually work and have Velero, hold the status until it's done. We need to actually have the controller changes in place. And this backup item action controller just updates to use the V2 API, but the logic is still the same as before. Because it's a phased approach. We have to create the V2 plugin APIs first, which is what this PR does. The next step, and then the phase is, then there's going to be a PR that's I'm going to be working on in January that will add the logic to take that operation ID that's returned, if it is returned, and then do the actual async operation. So the right now the only POC here is really just making sure that this refactoring to allow for V2 plugins still works with all the existing V1 plugins, because we're not actually changing the business logic of the controller yet, other than using V2 plugins instead of V1. The next step, in January, is going to be actually to modify the backup controller to check that operation ID returned, and if it's not empty, then add it to that list, and then change, and then go to that new phase if there's something waiting, and kind of implement all that waiting code.
When we're reviewing the design, I think the general flow will work, but my concern is in some of the details, like we need to pull and update the item operation JSON in the object store. Will that performance or how that impact this general backup controller flow? Okay, so at the time the 1.11 is released, I think internally we do not really call these. We do not really need to implement any backup item action V2
that's right.
But the only implementation will be in some Red Hat internal plugin, right?
Right, exactly. In other words, the logic that will handle those those operations is in the Velero controllers, but none of the control of the plugins that we're releasing as part of Velero, that field is always blank, which means as long as you're only using the Velero controllers, Velero plugins, then we're never going to actually be uploading anything, because the list of operations is going to be empty. So the logic is going to be there, but basically those if blocks or those loops are going to be skipped, because the list of things we have to deal with is zero, is empty.
So as for your internal plugin that will implement this V2 BIA plugin APIs, will that be open source also? Because look like we publish a new API, and we should have something as a implement reference, so that other developers.
Right now, everything that we're doing is on GitHub as well. Most of it's under GitHub/OpenShift. Actually, I think the data mover is under it's under a different. I think it's under GitHub.com/MigTools. I think I have to get back to you on that one. I forget exactly, because I know we did some repo moving, but all of that work is in publicly available GitHub repos. Right now, we're not using any of that, because basically we can't do any of that work to implement the new plugin APIs with those plugins until the Velero work includes the controller changes at least get merged to main.
Oh, I see.
Just because that's kind of the Velero work to allow the plugin operations to work at all. Needs to be in place first, and then we can write a plugin that makes use of the new feature.
Yeah. So when 11 release, I hope there will be some reference somewhere to reference to that implementation, so that other.
Yeah, I mean, at a minimum, we can point to that and say this is being done. The other thing we can do is, if it makes sense. Again, I don't know if there's some way of pulling out a kind of minimal reference, to Velero plugin example that actually uses this. Because right now, most of what's in Velero plugin example is really just, printing out log messages in the execute, and it's not really doing any functional, plugin work. It's just kind of showing, hey, if you take this code and you build it and you add it as a plugin, it'll run, and then it's up to you to add what do you need to do in your logic. But in the case of showing with Velero 111 what you can do with this. Certainly, we can point to that example of saying, here's a plugin that's built that uses this. That's a plugin that is only going to work for someone if they have VolSync installed and are using all those components. So it's not a standalone plugin that doesn't require infrastructure around it, because that integrates in with. But we can figure out what makes sense there. Certainly pointing there in docs to say, here's an example of using this for 111. We can do that. And if it makes sense to come up with a smaller example plugin that's more standalone, I'm just not. The thing is that for it to actually demonstrate this is an operation that will take a while, and it will show that the backup is going to be in some intermediates that waiting for plugin operation state. The plugin would need to do something external, create a CR of some sort. I mean, I guess you could even kind of fake this by having a plugin that creates, I don't know, a config map or something.
Yeah, I think,
with some kind of timestamp, and just have a plugin that automatically says, okay, the operation is to create this config map, and we're going to define it as complete when the config map, timestamp is, 5 minutes, some configurable thing to set, so that it would be a very, very kind of rough proof of concept to say, here's an example of something that will take 5 minutes because the plugin is just creating a config map or a secret or some, small thing that then it checks to see, instead of checking a status on it, which is what you would normally do in a real world plugin, it's just going to check timestamp and to say, hey, I'm going to declare this thing complete when it's existed for 5 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, but I think of this a little differently, Scott. I think instead of faking anything like you mentioned, it would be better if you add a reference to the Red Hat plugin to understand what it really functions in the real world, right?
We should do that too. I mean, we should point to that saying, here's a real world example that uses this. I was just saying, if you wanted someone to be able to test this out, you could add a Velero plugin example, something that fakes it, just so because they may not be able to take the the Red Hat example and use it in their cluster if they didn't have VolSync and the other components that are needed for that, for example. But if we had a plugin example that ran like that, then they I don't mean this instead of that. I think you could do both. We need to point to the real world example saying, here's an actual project that's using this new API for something relevant to its design. But you could create a plugin example that kind of forced the backup to go into that state for a little while, and then kind of demonstrating the workflow.
Yep. I see. Yeah. Okay, let's do that. And yeah, thank you. Yeah, so that's part of the status update. Do you have any other thing we want to mention in this part? Okay, so let's move to the discussion topics. So Ordin write a good PR about clarifying the release cadence and process. I had a few comments. So if anyone's interested, please also take a look and let Ordin knows your thought. In addition to that, I have something I want to discuss with you, Scott. It's about how Velero handles metadata during restore. In our internal product, using Velero to restore some internal workload, we found that Velero deliberately drop most of the metadata of an object or resource during restore. So Velero is not restoring things like finalizers, managed fields. Are these by design, or is it because at that time we don't put that lot of stuff in the metadata, so the developer thought it should be good enough to just restore like name or label?
Right. I don't know. I don't have a 100% answer on that. I know this has been the case since before I started working on Velero.
Okay.
And I have a vague memory that Dylan may have had a conversation with Steve or one of the other early developers about this a while back. Dylan's not available for the call now, but I think the main issue is that there's some fields there in a generation, other ones where you don't want to restore them. And so and that was the question of, do you want to list all the things that you don't want to restore? Or do you want to list things that you do want to restore?
Right. So
I think they decided that the whitelist approach was safer, because that way, if a new Kubernetes version added new fields that we don't want to keep, that prevented new changes in Kubernetes, or someone's for example, if you're on OpenShift, there might be additional fields that a base Kubernetes cluster wouldn't have, that again you may not want.
Yeah. So I think
there's a couple of things we could consider. There may be certain things, like you said, finalizers, managed field. There might be certain fields we want to go ahead, as a simple fix for now, just add to that list of the small set of things we wanted to include. I wonder if we wanted to have an optional spec field, kind of a list of metadata fields to keep. That way, if someone,
in other
words, I think by default we still want to be careful about making a change that'll bring a whole bunch of things in.
Yeah, because I was thinking maybe we should switch to the blacklist or block list approach to explicitly tell Velero you should by default restore everything instead of some certain fields. So you're saying we should stick with a whitelist approach?
Yeah, the main reason I guess I would hesitate on kind of switching to just the block list approach is that I just don't know if there are situations in certain clusters or in certain architectures where there's other fields that are not standard Kubernetes fields that you also don't want to restore.
Okay. Okay.
So I'm thinking we might want to consider a couple of things. One, again, is if there's certain things like finalizers that we know we always want, let's just add that. But we also may want to consider adding a spec field, which will provide a list of, a list of metadata fields to keep. That will allow a user to override default behavior. To say, instead of using this default list, they provide a list, so that will allow them to add or remove. Say some user doesn't want finalizers restored, they can provide a list without finalizers. But if they want to add some other fields, custom, or maybe again, these are things that in some version of Kubernetes they're using, it has a field that isn't in base Kubernetes that they want to add, that Velero is not going to know about anyway. At the code level, this kind of spec field would allow them to customize what they restore.
So you're saying you're letting user to define the whitelist in the spec. So do you think that would be easier if you let user define the block list in the spec, so that we by default we restore everything until on some certain class or distro user thinks user is adding some customized field in the metadata, and that's problematic. If we restore it, the user just add it to the block list to tell Velero, hey, do not restore it and restore everything else. Yeah. Would that be?
I mean, we could even take the approach like we do, because most of the other areas where Velero lets the user decide what to, like with resources, for example, in namespaces, we have the include and the exclude list, and then they combine. So if you specify an exclude list, then everything else is included. And if you specify an include list, then everything else is excluded. So it may be, if we're going to add a spec field for this, we could create both, exclude metadata fields and include metadata fields. That'll give the user the option of either approach. And then we have a default that, if user doesn't specify anything, we go back to something like a set of defaults. And we might want to, this may be an issue where, again, I guess we already have a couple of issues here, but maybe a more general issue of, so we can get some feedback from others as to, if there are certain fields that we know need to be excluded or included, what makes sense here. Just because, unfortunately, none of the people that were working on Velero when this original decision was made are still here, because this was worked out well before I started working on the project.
Yeah. So when you support the like OADP or your product that uses Velero, is there any requirement from the user requesting like they should restore additional fields from metadata, like finalizer or manager field?
Off the top of my head, I don't remember seeing that. And if we had an issue that we were kind of discussing this on, I could ask Dylan or Shubham if either of them had run into this.
Okay.
As well.
Yeah, because we are hearing requirements like we should restore finalizer management fields, and even owner reference. That's a tricky one because that will impact the order of the objects
exactly.
being restored. You need to restore someone first to get UID to populate the owner reference.
Yeah. So and that's why I guess because you're getting different requests from different customers and different users. I'm kind of thinking there's probably two tasks here. One is to figure out whether what we're doing by default needs to be modified, adding certain things or whatever. But also, do we need to make it configurable in case not every user has the same needs?
Yeah, that makes sense. But think if we allow user to set or choose to restore owner reference, that will be even more problematic because it will cause some chaos, because we choose to restore owner reference, but we do not set it right.
Right.
until we
and there may be certain
reorder.
fields like that we just want to say, look, we can't do this, and here's why, and it'll break things, and that's a possibility as well. If we don't want to do on references.
Yeah, so you also, because this one is really, I think, widely used when there is for some CR based resources or objects, because when you create a CR, quite usually there are a lot of other resources created after that, and
Yeah.
they create their own reference. If
Right.
that one is not restored correctly, it really breaks the relationship of the resources.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, definitely. And the other thing is that some types can figure it out. Like when you restore a deployment and its pod, the controller seems to figure that out and reset those references properly.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what I would really want to check with your opinion, because some of these fields should be handled by controllers.
Right. But for example, I think in some cases, and I think Damon Set's one of them that I remember. Again, this may have changed, but a year or two ago, I remember if you restored the pod, it wasn't getting the owner reference set on restore, and so you ended up with this pod that was restored that no longer was connected to the daemon set. And then, of course, the daemon set controller would recreate the new pod, so you end up with duplicate pods. And one way we handled that on the Red Hat side was that we actually have a plugin where we actually, in most cases, choose not to restore pods with owner references, because if you restore a deployment, that will automatically create new pods. So you don't need to restore the pod unless you have restic restores or post restore hooks. Then you do need that pod. So there's some logic around there that can be handled in plugins. But in terms of owner references itself, I don't really know. I guess we haven't tried it. I mean, I don't know again what the consequences would be if setting them, and like you said, if they get set wrong, or if you for example, if you restore something with an owner reference, but you don't restore the thing that it pointed to, that could be a problem.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident that deployment controller will reconcile the owner reference, but I'm not sure if daemon set does that.
Right. Yeah.
So,
at one point it didn't. I don't know if it still does. That may be, that was in an older Kubernetes version. Maybe it does now. I don't know.
Okay.
But there's also owner references and other things even that aren't pods. That's a kind of a more general thing. And there's owner references that point to custom operators that we have no idea about because they're not for Kubernetes.
Yeah, because I was thinking I can push back such requirement and tell them like, hey, you should refine your controller so that the owner reference can be reconciled. But if even in Kubernetes, I mean, classical resources, they don't reconcile the owner reference. It may be really tricky because we really don't have a good way that generally how Velero can handle owner reference correctly. That will require a lot of change, right?
Yeah, so I think owner reference is a special case. We need to figure out what we need to do about that. And like I said, I don't really know.
I think I may reach out to you or other maintainer to discuss this particular field in the future, because that's become more and more controversial here, whether Velero should restore it or not internally. But currently, what I'm telling them is that you should let controller reconcile it. But they're like, if Velero can handle that, then why should controller handle it? There's some back and forth. So yes. So you now do not have a strong opinion, right? Like whether it should be handled by controller or Velero. What do you think?
I guess I don't really know, mainly because I don't know, like if we did restore them in Velero, what other changes we would need to make is, and again, I don't know if that would have unpredictable changes in other controllers too, because right now with some controllers, if you don't restore owner references, it could break that controller. But I
Right.
also wonder if there may be other controllers where if you do restore the owner reference, it could break it. I just don't know.
Okay, but at least I think
It
that's a
might be
big.
worth testing it out in various environments and say, okay, you're just going to make a local change, to restore it and see what happens in various kinds of workloads. It's just to kind of experiment with it, to kind of as a proof of concept to see what Velero would do there and how daemon sets and deployments and other things handle that.
Yeah, but I think letting Velero restore the owner reference is already a big chunk of work, because Velero will need to figure out the dependency and somehow reorder the resources during the restore. And you need to create resource A. After resource A have a UID, somehow set the UID in resource B, and so that resource B can, or object B can reference the resource A correctly.
Yeah,
That's already a lot of
UID
work.
would be different. Yeah, I guess
Right.
that's the challenge there too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think I'll think about it and maybe discuss with you in some future discussion. But that's a really tricky one. And you don't hear any requirement about this one? No. Okay.
I don't remember running into this, but again, I think part of that is certainly on the pods side, because our approach with the controllers has been to basically, with pods at least, is to not restore pods with owner references, because we're going to let their controller recreate the pod. So we have a pod control plugin, restore item action, that basically says if there's owner references here and there's no restic, well, if there are owner references and we're not using restic and we don't have post restore hooks on the pod, then we just don't restore the pod. Because if you restore a deployment without a pod, the deployment controller will scale that up to the right number of replicas and create new pods. But again, if you have restic annotations, for example, that doesn't work. You need the the pod there because of the init control of the init to container and everything else that we do. So
okay, yeah, I see that's a tricky problem. Yeah, I'll think about it. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I guess that's all I want to discuss. Do we have any other topic we want to discuss in today's meeting? Okay, if there's no, let's wrap up, and happy holidays, guys. Scott, if you need any quick review or response, just feel free to ping us on Slack.
okay. Well, again, I think the ones that are ready for review, it would be great if we could get those reviewed and merged this week. Or at least if there's comments that I need to make changes, that's fine too. But the backup item action API,
Okay.
so there's that one. Yep. And I would say the backup restore phases. So yeah, this one here. That's a smaller plugin. That should be relatively. This will be the easiest one to review just because it's pretty limited in its scope.
Yeah.
I would say that's a high priority.
Yeah, I'll definitely follow up this one, and
the design is good to get reviewed just while it's still fresh on our minds, because we reviewed the other design before. But that's not blocking me. I would say the backup item action and the new phases are the two high priorities, because those are the things that are going to block what I need to work on next. The restore item action will become a higher priority after those get put in, but that's it's not ready to review yet, so don't worry about it. So just those two are the ones that I would say, if we can get enough reviews to either merge this week or at least get comments if I need to fix things, either one, that would be great.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. Yeah, we'll handle that with priority. Let me take some note in another window. Okay. Yeah, we'll do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you, guys. Happy holidays. I'll see you back 2023.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.